Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Can I request all of you to please be seated? We now start the first session titled The Enlightenment and Western Foreign Policy. May I now invite on dais the session chair, Krishnan Srinivasan, and the speakers, Veronica Sutherland, James Mayall, and Salman Haidar. Over to you, Mr. Srinivasan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I should thank you very much indeed for your attendance. And I would like also especially to thank the foreign participants for their attendance today and tomorrow, because of course you all know there have been some developments over the past 2 weeks which could have put you off, and I know that flights have been disrupted in many cases, so your presence here is really very greatly appreciated. I'd like to just say a word about formalities before we begin. I think all of us have innumerable titles and decorations and other honorifics, but I think for the purpose of this conference we just stick to names, which is much easier, and dispense with the various honorifics. Just to introduce the subject, the birth of the Enlightenment has, well, I should say first that from a very India-based inaugural session, we're now coming rather dramatically to a highly different kind of topic, which is the Enlightenment and Western foreign policy. And I think this is an enormously interesting subject. The Enlightenment itself has many birthdays, but let's say generally it began from the Renaissance and the Reformation, and between approximately 1550 for 300 years till 1850, it really swept across much of the Western world. Particularly in Europe, for example, England, Scotland, France, Holland, Prussia, Russia. And in that process, it went across the Atlantic to the United States, what became the United States, and then came back after the American Revolution in greater force. And it affected numerous aspects of life: rationalism, modern economics, individual rights, and all aspects of Western political and intellectual thought which continue even today. So, in other words, it is the very seedbed. Enlightenment is the very seedbed of the values that we find in the foreign policies of the Western countries. And to give greater insights into this aspect, we have three excellent speakers, and I'd like to begin by inviting Veronica Sutherland to talk on this subject.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Could I just first of all say how very delighted I am to be back here in India, which is a special country to me for all kinds of reasons. I lived here for 3 years in the 1970s, and I met my husband here, and we love coming back. So it's a very special place, and we're very delighted that Chris has enabled us to make this journey. Now, turning to the Enlightenment, let me follow on from what Chris has said, and indeed from a number of comments that were made this morning by our two distinguished speakers before the break. I'll start with a three-word quote from Immanuel Kant, with which he summed up what he perceived as the core value of the Enlightenment: dare to understand. But that is a deceptively simple definition of the core value of the Enlightenment, because since then there have been many different views of what the precise nature of the Enlightenment and its values was. Some people claim that it was a Northern European movement in which Spinoza, Kant, Hobbes, and Hume held sway, with their emphasis on pure reason. Others have held that it was primarily a French phenomenon, led by Rousseau and Diderot, embracing the romantic notion that reason could not be separated from emotion, and that rather than problem solving, the heroic struggle was the greatest good. And there have been many other nuances in these definitions as well. But today I think it's generally accepted that the Enlightenment, or the heyday, if you can call it that, of the Enlightenment, spanned the years between the late 17th and early 19th century, and that it started as a reaction against the dogmatic teachings of the churches and the overweening power of autocratic governments. So Immanuel Kant and like-minded thinkers sought in their writings to reconcile the conflicting claims of political authority and individual freedom, concluding that there was a categorical imperative to act as you would want other people to act towards all other people. These thinkers, their explorations of these and related topics covered many volumes, but the values they espoused can be summed up as four main principles: reason, science, tolerance, and peace. Foremost amongst these was reason, which these thinkers held to be non-negotiable. They opposed what they perceived to be delusions such as religious dogma or dictatorial authority, and sought a secular foundation for morality. They did not, however, believe that humans were perfectly rational agents. On the contrary, the deliberate application of reason was necessary precisely because human beings are prone to irrationality. Thus, Enlightenment thinkers attached importance to escaping from ignorance and superstition through scientific research, including an understanding of human thought and emotions. Working for the well-being of individual human beings was also an important element in their thinking, and here they tended to privilege the claims of the individual over that of race, nation, or religion. This led them to oppose all forms of oppression, including religious violence of any kind, despotism, slavery, or executions for minor offenses. Tolerance towards others was an essential part of the Enlightenment mindset. Their views on peace were well ahead of their time. Hitherto, war had been seen as a divine punishment to be endured. But in his work, Perpetual Peace, Kant argued rather that it should be seen as a practical problem to be mitigated and ideally solved. He laid out measures that would discourage leaders from dragging their countries into war. Together with international commerce, he recommended representative republics or democracies, mutual transparency, norms against conquest and international interference, freedom of travel and immigration, and a federation of states that would adjudicate disputes between them. All this surely has a modern ring. It was, however, many years before such values came to be fully accepted as the norms of Western society. While the 19th century saw a number of thinkers who enlarged upon the work of their earlier Enlightenment predecessors, it was essentially a period when power politics was the driving force in international relations. Wars were fought, both in Europe and America, and further afield, as European powers sought to dominate at home and extend their influence in distant lands, in particular in Asia and Africa. Might was right. Thus, in these years, rationality in international affairs was more often than not overshadowed by the pursuit of power. There were those who believed in trying to improve the lives of those less fortunate than themselves, not least the determined men who fought for the abolition of slavery. And some, at least, of those involved in colonial expansion believed in helping indigenous peoples. And if I may be a little personal, it included a forebear of mine who fell out with the British authorities in Calcutta, took up residence in a village near Darjeeling, where he undertook scientific research and produced a grammar and dictionary, which are still today the authoritative texts of the local language. You can Google him to find out if you want. But such people were the exception, and the majority would no doubt have justified wars and expansionist policies on the grounds that it brought prosperity at home. Inasmuch as they thought about Enlightenment values, it would have been in relation to Western men, with little thought to women or conquered peoples. It was not until the mid-20th century, and after two catastrophic wars, that the values of the Enlightenment came to be accepted as the bedrock of international relations. The trauma of the Second World War caused world leaders, mainly from the West, to work together to set up what in 1945 became the United Nations. The UN Charter lays down the principles designed to achieve worldwide cooperation in solving international problems, whether economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian, and to promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. Threats or use of force against another country are forbidden. Echoes of Enlightenment thinking are clear to see. This is equally true of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which enshrines principles which can be traced directly back to Immanuel Kant and his contemporaries. Article 1 sets the tone. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Rights include equality before the law, while torture and degrading treatment are specifically forbidden. All the major Western powers supported this declaration, as did India, China, Thailand, Burma, Ethiopia, and several Muslim countries. The Soviet bloc abstained. Over the years, additional international bodies were set up, some to deal with practical problems, such as refugees or development projects, others to establish a legal framework for such sensitive issues as the protection of the independence and sovereignty of states, or the law of the sea. Yet others were designed to promote international peace through dialogue, as proclaimed in the opening sentence of the Constitution of UNESCO, that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Nor were economic affairs neglected. In parallel with efforts to promote international cooperation in the political sphere, the United States and Britain took the lead in setting up the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, which led to the establishment of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The aim here was to stabilize the global monetary system, thereby avoiding any repetition of the damaging events of the 1930s, which were held by some to be partly responsible for the outbreak of war in 1939. Later, world trade came to be regularized, first by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and later by the World Trade Organization. The leaders involved in these initiatives no doubt hoped that they would lead to a peaceful world based on democratic values, the rule of law, open economies, and the observance of human rights. How then have these noble aims fared over the last 70 years? In the 1940s, world leaders were concerned above all to avoid the disaster of another major war. From the narrow perspective of North America and most of continental Europe, they had considerable success in this respect, as over the last 70 years, these territories have been free from military engagement between sovereign governments. The facts, however, show a more complicated and less happy picture. Peace was far from universal, nor was it in Western Europe a foregone conclusion. Western leaders were initially reluctant to accept that the values enshrined in the UN Charter and related documents should apply equally to those who lived in what they perceived as their imperial possessions. This resulted in many quarters of the world in bloodshed, which remains a matter of painful memory. It was not until the 1960s that opinion shifted significantly, with Harold Macmillan's Wind of Change speech being a seminal moment in progress towards decolonization. Turning closer to home, following the defeat of Nazism in 1945, a new threat to the West emerged from the Soviet Union and its satellites in the Warsaw Pact. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established to counter this threat from the communist world. And in parallel, the seeds of the European Union were sown as former combatants joined together in a spirit of peaceful cooperation. A balance of power between the two blocs on either side of the so-called Iron Curtain was maintained, thanks largely to the nuclear deterrent on both sides. There were moments of extreme danger, such as the Cuban crisis in the Kennedy years, but reason prevailed and the situation was saved. This uneasy peace continued until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent disintegration of the Soviet Union. At that stage, Western powers could be perhaps forgiven for believing that these watershed events signaled a victory for the liberal values they espoused. For a time, this appeared to be so, as former members of the Warsaw Pact sought membership of NATO and the European Union. Whether this led to a certain overconfidence on the part of Western leaders wishing to embed their values overseas, it is hard to say. But the years since the early 1990s have seen a series of Western interventions in conflicts overseas. In hindsight, some of these seem ill-judged, and if the aim was to promote liberal values, of limited success. Historically, the first of these interventions followed the breakup of Yugoslavia. The history and politics of the Balkans is complicated, and it is doubtful if any outside intervention could have prevented the years of war between the many ethnic groups in this area. Certainly, it proved impossible for UN peacekeepers to avert the disasters which took place, and NATO airstrikes failed to cow the Bosnian Serbs into surrender. On the other hand, it was a US initiative which led to the Dayton Accords of 1995, which have preserved a semblance of order in the area since then. A word on military interventions abroad by sovereign governments. This should be considered in the context of UN legislation defining the circumstances in which such action can be deemed legitimate. These include self-defense, response to a request from another sovereign state, and conformity with a resolution of the UN Security Council. And although not specifically mentioned in law, it is clearly unwise to intervene in any situation without a reasonable expectation of success and a plan for follow-up action. Where these requirements are observed, outside intervention can be successful. The first Gulf War of 1990-91 is generally held up as an example, as is on a smaller scale the intervention in Sierra Leone a decade later. But failure to observe these conditions courts disaster, as various Western forays into the tinderbox of Afghanistan and the Middle East demonstrate. While early this century, Western involvement in Afghanistan was sanctioned by the United Nations, reason should have counseled caution against intervention in a country where a combination of harsh territory and powerful warlords means that outside meddling risks humiliating defeat. Witness the lonely return to India from Kabul by Dr. Brydon following the first British-Afghan War in 1841. Recent Western intervention avoided casualties on a similar scale, but were unsuccessful in the stated aim of removing the Taliban from the country. In contrast to the war in Afghanistan, there was no clear UN mandate for the American-British invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was also characterized by misjudgment and inadequate planning. While Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair may have believed their aims were rational and laudable, the report by Sir John Chilcot into this initiative demonstrates that they operated without full UN cover on the basis of flawed intelligence and with no clear plan for handling the aftermath. The result has been many years of chaos in Iraq. The so-called Arab Spring of 2010 also prompted a confused response from Western leaders. This should have been seen for what it was, a series of spontaneous anti-government uprisings, rather than a concerted effort to bring democracy to the area, thus deserving Western support. As it has turned out, Western intervention was a hindrance to progress in many of the countries concerned, and Libya, for one, has proved ungovernable. And again in Syria, Western powers seem to have misread the situation with their support for dissidents who were far from united in purpose and would have been incapable of installing Western-style democracy to replace an undoubtedly harsh dictator. And here the situation is further complicated by Russian support for the Syrian government forces, thus risking a confrontation between two major powers. The dangers of intervention, even in pursuit of liberal ideals, are clear. In recent years, the world has become increasingly difficult for those who support democratic values and the rule of law. The Western world is now led by a man whose instincts seem to be isolationist and actions unpredictable. Many Western countries face the growth of nationalism. My own country is not immune from this, as the unedifying debate over Brexit has shown. And liberal governments must also contend with the increasing power of autocratic foreign governments responsible for incursions into neighboring territory and violations of human rights. Hard choices have to be made in which domestic expediency vies with the requirement to uphold the standards of behavior laid down by the UN. Often, domestic self-interest holds sway. There is no clear path out of these dilemmas. While the founders of the United Nations might have hoped that the organization would be a strong force in support of liberal values, in practice, its power has proved limited. And our speaker beforehand spoke about the need to reform the United Nations, and perhaps that might be a way forward indeed. But whether individual Western governments can join together to defend the values rooted in the Enlightenment remains to be seen. And I have to say, in my view, the omens are not entirely encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. And James Mayall.
Krishnan, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Like Veronica, it's always a huge pleasure to me to come back to India, which fortunately I'm able to do fairly regularly, partly because, like her, I have long-standing family relation. My daughter was born just up the road in Chanakapuri. Krishnan said that the Enlightenment has many birthdays. I think I go for the later birthday that Veronica sketched, starting with the French philosophe and the Scottish Enlightenment. And on that reading, the architecture of contemporary international society predated the Enlightenment. The foundations were laid down in the mid-17th century in the negotiations that brought to an end the period of long period of sectarian violence that had divided Western Christendom. The principles that emerged from the peace treaty that ended the 30 Years' War, the primacy of political sovereignty and its entailments, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, and territorial integrity, was subsequently exported to the rest of the world by the European imperial powers. The Westphalian Order, as it tends to be called, was consistent with its prehistory, with a Hobbesian rational logic, and to that extent was relatively easy to recast in a universalist form under the impact of later liberal ideas. But it was not at the time understood as a universalist set of values that should underpin the foreign policies of all states. In Europe itself, realpolitik was a much more important framework for foreign policy than enlightened values, which had not yet been articulated into a coherent intellectual system. Religion was not privatized by the new order, although religious war between states was effectively prescribed. In every other respect, rulers were free to pursue their interests by whatever means they chose, up to and including conquest. And it was, of course, that freedom which allowed the European powers to first subordinate the major parts of the world, the other non-Western major parts of the world, to Western political rule, and then, aided by the technological advances of the agricultural, industrial, and scientific revolutions, created a global system of economic and strategic interdependence, which has continued to develop and persists to the present time. Nonetheless, the Enlightenment had a major impact on both Europe and the rest of the world. The nature of this impact was highly ambiguous from the start, if only because of the unavoidable tension between the idea of universal freedom and free inquiry, which on most accounts constitutes the essence of enlightenment, and the realities of power and cultural diversity. The problem with the Enlightenment was not merely its universal claims, but that it was potentially subversive everywhere. The consequence for Western politics, and by extension for Western foreign policies, was brilliantly summed up by Ortega y Gasset, the Minister of Culture in the Spanish Republican government in 1932, shortly before the National Socialists came to power in Germany. In the revolt of his book, The Revolt of the Masses, he writes, "In the 18th century, certain minority groups discovered that every human being, by the mere fact of birth, and without requiring any special qualifications whatsoever, possessed certain fundamental political rights, the so-called rights of man and the citizen. And further, that strictly speaking, these rights, common to all, are the only ones that exist. This was at first a mere theory, the idea of a few men. Then those few began to put the idea into practice, to impose it and to insist upon it. Nevertheless, during the whole of the 19th century, the mass, while gradually becoming enthusiastic to these rights as an ideal, did not feel them as rights. The people had learned that it was sovereign, but did not believe it. Today, and he's talking about 1932, the ideal has been changed into a reality, not only in legislation, which is the mere framework of public life, but in the heart of every individual, whatever his ideas may be. Ortega y Gasset was alarmed, and he had every reason to be alarmed. His solution was the same as that of other liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill. In other words, educate the mass society so that everyone would come to share the same liberal values. But he feared that there was no time. And we know that education in any case is no guarantee that the Enlightenment project will succeed. Highly intelligent people are perfectly capable of adopting illiberal ideas and values. Of course, the Enlightenment was about other things than political freedom and rights. But since the material achievements that are generally accredited to it in agriculture, industry, and science all depend on intellectual freedom and rational inquiry, unconstrained by religious or cultural prohibitions, it's difficult to avoid the universalist political claims to which it also led. Given the inherent tension between the liberal universalism to which Enlightenment thought seemed to point, and the fact that even during the period of Western imperial domination, humanity was not only culturally diverse, but politically divided into different states and empires, it's perhaps fortunate that foreign policy and even more diplomacy remained, for the most part of the world, an elite pursuit. I think it's probably a fair assumption that hierarchical societies find it easier to handle contradictory commitments and beliefs than egalitarian democracies. I've been struck while I've been here, I've been reading a biography of Talleyrand and the forging of the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France. And of course, even when that process was going on, even when the Belgian crisis was being solved, what the liberals, what the Enlightenment, heirs to the Enlightenment wanted was a constitutional monarchy. They got one in France and they imposed one on Germany. So there was a sort of tendency to think not in terms of universal franchise. The Reform Bill in Britain hadn't happened, but in terms of an enlightened elite that would somehow maintain the peace. Against this background, I'll briefly consider three related areas where the Enlightenment has influenced Western foreign policies in the recent past. The first is the assumption that while the concept of empire, and I think this was a safe assumption following 1945, while the assumption that empire had become anachronistic was widely shared. The colonial liabilities, it was thought, could be turned into post-colonial assets, and with the assistance of Western economics and development economics in particular. The provision of foreign aid may not at first sight appear to have much to do with Enlightenment values, but it was clearly viewed as part of the price that had to be paid to persuade newly independent states to buy into the open, or at least relatively open, economic system represented by the Bretton Woods institutions and the GATT. This was clearly a legacy of the Enlightenment, even if it would not have been often described as such by professional economists or diplomats. It was a system that accepted the primacy of the sovereign state, and hence its right to discriminate legitimately in favor of its own citizens, but which in other respects treated all equally under the most favored nation principle. It was also consistent with the UN Charter, to which the vast majority of states had already signed up. It's difficult to imagine how any such system could be made to work except on the basis of some general universal assumptions. In the early years after decolonization, Western governments were much more respectful of state sovereignty in their aid policies than they subsequently became. In European countries that were aid donors, there was always a debate about the balance to be struck between aid tied to European exports and that provided to fill the gap between savings and investment on the basis of an allegedly dispassionate analysis of development needs. Politically, the justification for foreign aid was to maintain cordial relations with former dependencies. But liberal economics presented itself as a technical social science whose methods were applicable anywhere. By the 1980s, this position had been largely abandoned, and political conditions were frequently attached, particularly with respect to human rights. The tendency to use established economic relationships to leverage policy change in unrelated fields had a longer history in American foreign policy. I think it's fair to say that USA has not often hesitated to apply extraterritorial jurisdiction when it served its interests than in other Western countries. But the practice now spread to the European Union and to the international financial institutions. It furthermore foreshadowed the attempt to change the interpretation of sovereignty and to dilute its force in international affairs, to which I shall return in just a minute. Secondly, Western governments have presented their countries to the outside world as the avatars of modernity, particularly with regard to cooperation in science, technology, and higher education more generally. This is perhaps the area in which their claims to universalism have been most convincing. Evidence of scholarly cosmopolitanism developed early on, as for example, when the then president of the Royal Society, Joseph Banks, refused to accept a shipload of botanical specimens from the United States destined for the Paris Botanical Gardens that had been seized on the high seas by the British Navy during the 7 Years' War. This willingness to cooperate, and we've heard a little bit about this in earlier talks, and indeed to ignore contested political borders, has continued, as in Soviet-American space cooperation during the Cold War, and the extensive collaboration between Chinese and Western research universities which continues despite deep political differences over Tibet, the South China Sea, and other issues. But as power slowly shifts from west to east, an unavoidable and for Western countries uncomfortable question arises. Are Western claims that their values are universal, genuine, or merely pretensions left over from the period of Western hegemony? If the former, the fact that the modern international system bears a Western imprint is a purely contingent matter. If the latter, then, as global power drains away from the West, we should expect to see the new great powers seeking to imprint their own values on the system. We don't know, but so far at least, modernity seems to have been defined in Western terms. Lastly, and most controversially, and Veronica's already said quite a lot about this, there is the radical Western turn to liberal internationalism after the Cold War. The assumption that the major political issue in the world, how are human societies to be governed in an era of global interdependence, had been resolved, as Francis Fukuyama initially believed, by the triumph of liberal capitalist democracy over communism and central planning, undoubtedly led to an unjustified overconfidence. The idea that the Western formula, free elections, the rule of law, and an open economy, could be exported anywhere, regardless of the cultural, political, and religious context, reflected not universal values, but the arrogance of power. To be fair, this version of the Enlightenment project does not have its origins simply in Western triumphalism after the Cold War. Philosophically, as we've heard, it has its origins in Immanuel Kant's pamphlet Perpetual Peace, published in 1795. An economic version of it had been proposed by Jefferson to the French, under which sovereign barriers would be abolished between the two revolutionary states. But it was rejected by France, which wanted monopoly trading rights in and out of Boston against the British. A politicized version reappeared in the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson announced at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, and again in the Lend-Lease agreements and the Atlantic Charter on America's entry into the Second World War. But thereafter, until the 1990s, the missionary optimism of liberal internationalism was kept in check by the power political realities of the Cold War. When it finally came to an end, the enthusiasm for participatory democracy in many parts of the world, which had not previously enjoyed it, was perfectly genuine. As anyone, I wasn't an election observer, but I know many who were in South Africa and other places, or in Cambodia, which would be the classic case where people risked enormous danger in order to go and vote. So it was perfectly genuine. The publication of the Secretary General's report Agenda for Peace in 1992 perhaps marks the high watermark of this quasi-Enlightenment enthusiasm. But it soured quickly as a result of the international response to a succession of ferocious civil conflicts, and even more as a result of the unilateral intervention by the United States and its allies in Iraq in 2003. The widely perceived misuse of the new and always contentious principle of the responsibility to protect in Libya in 2011 further damaged the reputation of the West as the source of universal values and helped, I suspect, to lead to the populist backlash in many parts of the world. it's difficult to avoid the conclusion, at least I find it difficult to avoid the conclusion, that the West is now living with the predictable reaction to its futile attempt to make the world over in its own image in a post-imperial age. And we have to face up to the fact that the age of unreason may not be over. It's at least heartening that it appears to be enjoying a short afterlife north of Delhi at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Now I turn the floor over to Salman Haidar.
Thank you for letting me sit here and speak rather than struggle up onto the dais. Now, I was given only one indication, one instruction, when I was told to get ready and be prepared to speak here today. Instruction was, be brief. I have every intention of conforming to this expectation. The interrelated and mutually sustained events that came to be known as the Enlightenment in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries had a transformative effect and left a permanent mark whose impact cannot be wholly ignored even today. With the Enlightenment, the medieval world of the Dark Ages was dispelled, and a new era brought into being. As the name suggests, brightness and light drove out the shadows of the earlier era, the bad old days progressively giving way to the new and better. In an era of dramatic change, everything seemed open to question. The received certitudes of earlier times came under skeptical inquiry. Philosophy and politics took new directions. Even God himself did not escape unscathed. Scientific inquiry acquired a new dimension, and there was a great liberation of the human spirit, central to which was the celebration of reason, as seen in every field of human activity, as unfettered minds became free to range over what had earlier been a closed world. Radical new disciplines and doctrines were invented in response to these fresh impulses, such as deism, skepticism, atheism, and materialism. There was a great intellectual and cultural ferment. Some of the great figures of the time are the established giants of their era, who were pathfinders of the hitherto uncharted new course of intellectual activity. Individuals like Hobbes, Locke, Bentham, Rousseau, and Voltaire prominent among them. Collectively, they brought a new awareness of human needs and demands and helped show the way to a new order of social development that offered a better onward path to humankind. There was a spirit of optimism and a firm belief in the need for progress in human affairs. And society could no longer fail to address important social and political issues that demanded attention. One of the legacies of the Enlightenment is the belief that human history is a record of general progress with ever-escalating demands for onward movement. Particular mention should be made of Western foreign policy, which was strongly influenced by establishment values. These served to promote concepts of fundamental freedom, which later in course became a cause or pretext for colonialism and the messianic urge to bring light to benighted people everywhere. As already mentioned, Enlightenment is a term reflecting a series of developments in Europe that had major global significance. Among its important qualities was a stimulus it gave to the study of the natural sciences and the way in which it encouraged a sweeping new cosmology that reshaped ideas about the shape and structure of the world around us. The Enlightenment was primarily a phenomenon that came out of Europe, which had led the way in overthrowing entrenched dogmas that were believed to have lost their validity. To an extent, the rationalistic impulses that were shaped at that time continue to stimulate the present day. In the universal global civilization that now increasingly holds sway, there is constant interchange between the different parts of the world and no room for narrow or parochial considerations about the future. India has been conscious from the start of the need to align itself with enlightened global opinion, as may be seen in the repeated call from its leaders to cultivate a scientific temper of mind. At the same time, India has also campaigned against superstition and intellectual prejudice. These ways of belief have become strongly established within the country and can, in many respects, ultimately be traced back to the legacy of the Enlightenment. But having said what I had to say on this theme, let me try and conclude on a more somber note. One cannot ignore something that sometimes has the appearance of a sort of counter-reformation. That may be overstating it, but there are countercurrents to be observed and to be handled today. Traditional societies feel under threat today. Humiliation is their lot, or so is believed to be their lot, at the hands of new and more thrusting and more successful forces today. In their time, these societies felt that they were the pacemakers, the innovators, sources of ideas and political ascendancy. Some of these reverberations of threat and challenge can still be can be felt, and they take a challenging form. Humiliation can be deeply felt, lead to a reaction that can take a violent form. This is indeed one of the difficult phenomena that need to be that mar the peace and tranquility of our times. These are matters that need to be addressed in meetings of this kind, along with other broader questions of human progress and development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salman. Well, what we've heard really is a narrative about the origins and virtues of the Enlightenment, which thereafter swept the world really on the backs of the imperial order. Now, inevitably, as has been pointed out, there arose contradictions between these virtues and values and the reality of imperialism. Now, there is greater stress on this because of the decline of the West and the rise of the East. That may be a cliche and open to challenge, but and yet this context is worth examining. I think you've been very patient for a couple of sessions. I think it's time now, with your permission, to give you an opportunity to ask questions of the panel. So if you wish to do so, please draw my attention to it.
It was enlightening to listen to distinguished speakers. I think I'm asking a question in this context. There is no EU's common foreign policy. Is it a product of enlightenment that what matters most are the interests and not values? And coming to the human rights, are they followed more in breach or practiced?
I think you're absolutely right that there's no single EU foreign policy, although one ought to say, of course, that the EU is the only, I think I'm right in saying, the only international organization to have its own foreign service and to have a system for trying to articulate common positions on foreign policy issues. Sometimes it's more successful than on others. Notoriously, of course, it all came unstuck in 2003 over Iraq. On human rights, yes, of course, I think I'm right in saying that everyone, it wasn't true to begin with in 1948, but everyone has now signed up to the Universal Declaration, and there has developed, of course, a massive institutional regime around human rights, which for the professionals gets rid of the distinction which was there very much in the quote that I gave from Ortega y Gasset, that there are only very few rights. And these rights are, of course, negative rights. They're the rights which are, in principle, justiciable. Well, after the political arguments between the Western powers and the Group of 77 and supporting the Soviet Union, that was widened to include, when you get to the 1966 conventions on human rights, the economic and social rights are positive rights, which in the Western view, of course, are problematic as rights precisely because who has the obligation to provide you with a job, to provide you with housing, to provide so on and so forth. But I think even if you, whichever view, whether you take the broad sort of human rights regime view of rights, or if you take the narrower original view of human rights, yes, of course, they've always been honored in the breach as much as in the observance. The question comes whether it's more or less important that they are in the public domain and that at least in principle, states that have signed up can be, if not held to account, at least asked to explain themselves, which they are before the United Nations Committee. But I don't think, I think it would be marvelous if we could really think of a world in which everyone understood human rights in the same way and never abused them. But as we know, even according to the United Nations committees, virtually no country comes out unscathed under that heading.
Veronica, since Britain is still in the European Union, at least for 29 days, would you care to add a footnote on what James has said?
Now, I think he's covered it pretty well. The EU foreign policy element, I think, does have a fairly difficult task because there are so many disparate voices. And I have served in places, obviously, where the EU ambassador has gathered the EU representatives together for monthly sessions, generally. And we have discussed issues, and there is not always agreement at all. So I think that is a very long haul, with or without my country. I don't foresee an easy coming together of EU foreign policy anytime soon. On human rights, I think I really have very little to add to what James has said, except that it, and this is really a side comment which doesn't have any place in international relations that I'm aware of. We talk an awful lot about human rights and nothing at all about human duties. And I wonder if talking a little bit more about human duties might not help some of the problems of the world.
Professor Ashwini Ray?